I'm going to stream the video off all over.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
Don't worry. I'm going to jump feed. You can go into the office, but it's all right. Space like pretentious okay. 3, 2, 1. I have two things. Both of them contribute to electoral success for Labour that is far more long-term and consistent. Both of them also have their own individual harms. My first contention here is that 2019 to around now was literally the worst time for a party to be in government. It was unable to have much consequential policy changes, and it was going to be incredibly unpopular regardless of who was in power. They were going to have sustained unpopularity that was going to persist across this generation of new voters. I think there are two reasons as to why this is the case. First, I think Brexit was always going to be deeply, deeply damaging to whichever party needed to follow up with the specifics of how that operated. I would posit here that Labour and Conservatives would have basically had to do the exact same thing because the policy for Brexit was dictated by the EU rather than like Britain itself. The structural reasoning for this is that the EU wanted to punish the UK for leaving the EU and wanted to deter others from doing the same and from shattering the confidence in that union. I think it meant that the EU was much more hardball than even the Conservatives wanted to be when it came to a lot of things. It means that the policy wouldn't have been much different in the first place and would have caused drastic economic harms that would be blamed on the party that actually signed those deals into passing, even if previously it was done by a referendum, because you never blame the voter bloc which did the referendum, because that's seen as a thing of public support, and we see as the individual party of Labour as something that they needed to do better. Secondly, I think COVID and inflation basically just meant that this was not a time you're able to do any good in government, and you're going to be incredibly unpopular. First, because your ability to actually do any kinds of policy changes are incredibly constrained by two things. First, you have very little ability to do discretionary spending. A huge part of Labour agendas are things like improving the rights of minorities, of funding more things like welfare, etc. You're very constrained in your ability to do so because you don't have as much money to actually spend, because the money that you do spend has to be spent in very particular ways, for example, in stimulating the economy that the Conservatives already did. I think secondly, though, there's a lot of technocratic kind of advice that you need to follow when it comes to a pandemic, things like health advice where you get extreme backlash if you don't follow it. I think what this means is that both parties would have had extremely similar kinds of outlooks on this stuff. Secondly, though, I think the public scrutiny placed on government during this time simply meant that regardless of who was in charge, they were going to become incredibly unpopular, right? That is to say, two things here. First, the harms were going to be incredibly limited because public scrutiny was going to limit the harms that Conservatives could actually do. OG gives you an example of this very thing where celebrity backlash and public backlash caused the Conservative government to deviate from its initial plans. But secondly, it means that there's asymmetric credit in terms of success and failures. The government is always blamed for failures, but it's very easy for opposition parties to claim that other people are responsible for any kinds of successes that did exist. For example, thanking the NHS rather than thanking the Conservative government or the light Labour government that was in charge. I think furthermore, the fact that you were just economically worse off as a result of this meant that oftentimes this reflected in the government, even if there wasn't any rational basis for doing so. I posit here that the United data we see from democratic states shows us consistently that bad economic times result in people in power becoming deeply unpopular. I think Labour, furthermore, would have had to meet expectations of doing things like the inflationary policy that opening government suggests in ways that would have been actively harmful, because this is an inflationary crisis and would have caused further cost of living spiraling upwards. I think there are two things Labour could have done instead. Either they could have done things like increase taxes, done things like decrease the amount of spending and managing inflation better, managing debt better, in which case they would not have been seen as a party that cares about the welfare of people. And I think it would have been very difficult for them to win on progressive mandates in future elections, or they would have had to continue the progressive policy that would have led to further inflationary spirals. The reason these are bad is because it directly impacts people's cost of living. I posit now the vast majority of people understand what inflation is because it's literally making them unable to buy groceries, right? I posit that in some cases, obviously inflationary policy would have been a good thing, during COVID, for example, but that happened literally anyway, right? Because the Conservatives did it. And I think the fact that Conservatives did it means it's even harder for Labour to actually is even easier for labor to criticize them in the future because the conservatives added a lot of debt during the cycle of election. I think it's very difficult then to criticize like progressive parties on the most of the grounds they're often criticized on, for example, being fiscally irresponsible. If you can just point to the Conservative Party and say they spent a lot during this time, I think this is incredibly politically convenient for the Labour Party. I think that means that there are very few differences in the actual important policy that gets passed, but moreover, this time of political popularity is persistent because it's the time that people had the most interest in politics. Those perceptions were likely to remain and cause like long-term implications on like conservative unpopularity. Secondly, though, I think the second reason why Labour is better off is because they got rid of Jeremy Corbyn, and this was exceptionally good. I posit that Keir Starmer, who is like far more moderate, is simply a better leader for that party. There are two reasons why Corbyn needed to leave. The first is that he is seen as incredibly left-wing, and probably a big reason as to why he's seen that way is because he's actually just far less moderate than Starmer was, right? I think right-wing reactionism about like left-wing policy is highly effective here and meant that people were deterred from voting Labour. This is literally why Corbyn lost the election. Even if he won this election by the supposition of the motion, I think in future elections he loses for this reason, right? But moreover, I think Corbyn losing is necessary for a shift in the Labour strategy, right? Because of the ideologies around Corbyn that opening governments jest didn't lead to him winning an election, but rather led to people being incredibly deterred by this. Secondly, though, I think there were personal scandals that meant that it was very unlikely for Corbyn to have sustained popularity, specifically with regards to anti-Semitism. I don't need to show you these are true. All I need to show you is this was the perception that existed in the public at that time. What that meant, first off, is you lost Jewish voter bases, but you also had wider electoral consequences because it was very difficult for Labour to advocate as a party of social justice when they were also perpetuating real, tangible anti-Semitism that the Jewish friends I have from Britain would never vote for Labour for that reason until Corbyn was removed. I'll take closing.
Are you glad that Trump won in 2016?
Yeah, no. So I think this is very different because of the constrained actual policy effects that I talk about. I think this is quite a different thing. Okay, outside of electoral success then, I think the reason moderation is good is threefold. First, because it allows for better long-term policy influence. You're more likely to do things like compromise. This creates a more sustainable path of governance and deals a lot with the dichotomy of Labour and conservatives that OG mentioned. Secondly, I think the actual policy you pass is better, right? I think there are some things in the right wing that are just true, like markets often do work, taxes often do end up being incredibly distortionary and causing harms. I think then there are two implications of this. The first is you get better policy when people are willing to compromise and listen to other perspectives as a result of Keir Starmer being the leader. And secondly, I think you maximize the preferences of the large and most voters, right? I think voting necessarily implies a lack of agency where some people lose. We would posit it is better when the policy is closer to the median, where the fewest people lose as possible. I think that's a principled harm as well. Finally, I think it creates incentives for the Tories to moderate. The reason the Tory strategy of more and more conservatism and more right-wing stuff works is precisely because Corbyn is seen as the opposite and incredibly left-wing. When the Labours come closer to the centre, this is a good median voter theorem. I think the Conservatives are more likely to come to the centre as well in order to regain the moderate base that they capture. I think then, I want to be really clear here, the leadership crisis that results was really good for Labour. It means you probably stay in power for the next 15 years. It's not seen as a harm of democracy and erosion of democratic confidence. It's seen as the erosion of confidence in the Conservative Party, and that is the best thing that could have happened for Labour.
I think we did it The absolute shit time that British politics has been through since 2019 is the best thing that could have happened for a Labour government in terms of maintaining sustainable power for the next 15 years to come. Given that as the most important impact in this debate, I'm going to start by weighing why Tanae, what Tanae said is relevant. So why is sustainable image for Labour the most important impact in this round? First of all, note that we are likely to have increasingly bigger problems in the future, right? Like this, obviously COVID was bad, but we are likely to face increasingly larger crises because we're less and less prepared for the things that come. Climate change is coming. It is likely to affect us significantly more with each year that passes. We are likely to see an intensification in all of these harms. So we would rather have sustainable and proper and competent government from now on. Secondly, note that British politics tends to suffer from inertia, right? When one party wins, it tends to keep winning, right? COVID was perhaps the one time people gave a fuck about politics far more than any other time. This guarantees you 15 years of power for Labour, because when they looked at politics, when they saw such an incompetent Tory government, that's when disillusionment that the OG wants to talk about, no thank you, happens. That's when they see that there is no way in hell that Tories can do anything, and that it is far better, that there is no hope for Tories in the future whatsoever. I also want to note that I don't think this is a debate about any sort of external policy in this round. I think largely the issue we're debating is internal politics within the British country, particularly because that's where the most crises were at that time, right? Thirdly, also, I think in order, no thank you, for welfare to be relevant, you want it to be sustained, right? If government wants to claim a lot of welfare benefits on their side of the house, it's insufficient to have Labour in government for 2 years, because the types of policies welfare is important for, the types of spending that they're going to help, need to help entire generations of family in order to escape the cycles that they talk about. That is why we trade short-term, a bit of Corbyn in power, for sustainable existence, thank you, of Labour policies that can actually meaningfully help these people. Number 4, no Tanae's frame on polarization, right? To the extent to which this loss made the Labour Party internally reform and move towards a more moderate candidate that was able to talk to more people within the electorate and just garner more broad bases of support, I think that's a good and healthy and sustainable thing for British politics. Also, why would you have harmed Labour long term if they were in power in 2019? Because notice, panel, that I think in time people realized that Brexit was a terrible idea, but much of that was seen as they saw the Tories being incompetent to do a deal, right? Which was massively damaging for the Tories because they were unable to deliver on the very promises that they had happened, right? But I think that's right, and I think that's how it should have been, because if Labour would have been in power, it would have had to clean up the mess that the Tories would have created, which I think would have been terrible and incredibly tarnishing for the Labour parties in their approval ratings, right? I think if Labour were in power, 2 scenarios could have happened. Number 1, they would struggle to meet the Brexit negotiations, which they would have probably failed for the many reasons that Tanae gives you. Or number 2, no thank you, they would have taken a step back and would have said, we told you Brexit was going to be shit in the first place, so they wouldn't even have tried as hard in the first place, right? I just think when your hands are tied and you're in power and your image depends on it, it's kind of shit, even if you want to do, no thank you, good things. Now on direct engagement from a lot of government lines. Firstly, note that they tell us why Labour is likely to be more welfare oriented and how that's good. I would firstly want to point out that OG never proves that the specific Labour policies are better, right? Lockdowns have huge harms on poor people in terms of job losses and the inability to do a lot of their physical jobs. Spending lots of money would have made inflation incredibly worse, right? Inflation, no thank you, it's usually pretty fucking shit for poor people that can't hold their money in assets and property and have to keep their money in actual cash, and that money gets less valued over time, so their purchasing power decreases with every day that inflation happens. Equally important, they want to defend deficits. Who are those deficits going to fuck over in 2 years when the government is no longer going to be able to run incredible spending and is going to have to cut back on those very same policies? I don't think the welfare effects that they want to claim can be claimed. But also note that I'm not sure Labour would have been better in that particular instance in terms of COVID, particularly because their hands would have been tied. And also thirdly, I don't think it was that shit, no thank you, even a Tory government financed furlough schemes that allowed small businesses to keep workers employed. It wasn't that big terrible scenario that they're trying to talk about. Secondly, they go, Labour doesn't care about the economy and is going to run deficits. I think that's incredibly terrible because of the very same reasons of inflationary pressure that I've been talking about until now, but also because of the long-term effects of that, right? I don't think in a times of massive economic crisis attached, no thank you, to COVID, I don't think seeing that the war will have happened in the future, running a huge deficit and then incurring all of these extra spendings that came because of war is a particularly brilliant idea. Lastly, they go, you're going to have a lot of power struggles. I think to that extent, power struggles are inevitable within any party. I think like they obviously moved on. I'm not sure what the impacts of those power struggles fundamentally are. I'll take closing if there's any point.
Suppose Jeremy sucks. Why don't Labor just replace him with a better leader, and then they're good and they've got power?
That literally misses like the entirety of Tanae's point, because Tanae's point is like, you could have the best fucking Labour leader ever in power. You could have like, I don't know, God to lead Labour and come into power. That would still be shit because God couldn't really do much shit because negotiations would still be shit because Brexit was shit. There was no way for those negotiations to do, no thank you, to do well. And people would be like, oh my God, save us. And God would be like, no, I can't save you because nothing could have worked. So I don't care about Corbyn. The point is different. Listen to the point. Lastly then, no, thank you. Lastly, they go, you know, Tories and Bojo were incredibly irresponsible, and that's bad. Listen here, like the frame here panel is that if Labour were in power, maybe they wouldn't go to parties during lockdown, but I'm not sure that is like such a relevant thing compared to all of the things that they would have done. No, thank you. Like, I'm unsure why we care so much about the moral purity of these politicians who are going to be shit regardless. I think what we rather care is about the broad policy that they're trying to enact, right? And if Labour would have been in power, they couldn't have delivered on to their own electorate. They would have likely lost credibility in front of their own electorate because given they couldn't deliver on what they usually promise for, it is far likelier that their electorate would have lost hope that even a Labour government can give them what they want. I think this is incredibly damaging because notice that the Labour now can co-opt a lot of like the rhetoric against the Tories, can say, look at all of the ways in which you've been fucked over, and they can still co-opt hope on their side of the house, which feeds into the sustainability mechanisms that Tanae talks about. They would have been unable to co-opt hope had they not been able to be effective at any of the things that they talk about. If you want to talk about disillusionment, if you want to talk about the harms that happen upon the British politics, you see them when you see what the average voter thinks of the government right now after it has been in Tory power. They think it was shit, they think it was terrible, and we posit that's fantastic because it means we're likely not going to have Tory in power for the next 15 years, which are going to be crucial in defining our strategies for the future crisis that we're going to help, and which are going to be crucial in figuring out better ways to cater to the Labour electorate and the poor people. For all of these reasons, so glad to oppose.
Thank you for the fine speech. Welcome, member of the
Two extensions in the speech, and then if I have time, a third wacky one about chaos theory that Mark really wanted me to look at. First extension, why Labour could actually have been effective in government. Note that OG never really proves this, and this gets like quite a lot of airtime from OO. We're going to fill in that gap because all of their benefits are contingent on us actually approving this. A couple of reasons why Labour would have been effective. Firstly, because there would have been a moderating effect on the most kind of egregiously progressive voices in the movement, for like, you know, for example, the obvious example being like Jeremy Corbyn. And this is like the bulk of OO's case, which is like, you know, Jeremy Corbyn's a little bit insane, would have been like a bit of a dingbat and things would have gone bad. Why was that not the case? It's because, yes, Jeremy Corbyn has like an ideology that he cares about. He has a message that he wants to spread, but he's also a shrewd politician. He could not have survived in this landscape for decades and decades if he was not. Therefore, he cares about strategy. And notably, because of the fact that he made so many promises to the electorate, he knows for a fact that if he can't deliver on any of them, because there is a deadlock within his party, because he's being knifed by his own like factions within his party, he knows that he's going to get absolutely destroyed. So he has a keen incentive to be a little bit more moderate, which means that you don't get any of the kind of worst case scenario stuff that OO wanted to talk to you about. Like, also note that he's like one dude in the entire party. I think that, yes, the prime minister is important, but they do not control every single lever of government. And to that extent, all of their arguments about moderation, even the worst case scenario, can be severely mitigated. I also, so like, if like OO wants to get away with saying that moderation generally is good, we prove that you do get moderation to some extent in the Labour Party. Note that, by the way, the Tories aren't famously moderate either. I think, for example, Boris Johnson was not notably very moderate, quite an abrasive individual, and also very ideologically extraordinarily conservative. Second reason why Labour would have been effective is because Labour MPs would have rallied around Jeremy Corbyn instead of going against him. Because, note, if Labor had won in 2019, it would have been a massive, unprecedented victory for Labor. After years and years of Tory government that seemed unshakable, and also note that Tory got like record turnout, especially from key demographics of young people. So if he had actually translated that into an electoral victory, this would have been a home run for the Labor Party, which means that electorally, all of the Labor MPs, even the ones that aren't super on Corbyn's side, would have rallied around him and meant that he could actually push policy through. What do we get from OO? They say like one thing, which is like, oh, you don't actually get any sort of like welfare funding because we've been constrained in fund. You would have been constrained. Two responses. Firstly, in the instance of crisis, the government has the biggest mandate to spend. If you get like the COVID crisis, obviously that justifies you spending heaps of money. So actually, I think crisis would have enabled the Corbyn government to do a lot of welfare spending. But secondly, like there's a chronology problem, right? I think the vast bulk of the funding, the critical funding would have happened before the crisis. For example, NHS funding would have started in 2019, which preempted COVID, which means that even if like your hands are tied during COVID, at least you would have had that initial burst of investment, which means that like you actually can do things like an efficient rollout and not have people wait for hospital beds and things like that. Okay, under this, the second thing I want to talk about on this extension is electoral success into the future and actually meet the challenge that OG tries just to dodge. A couple of things about why this means that electorally Labor is better off into the future. Firstly, Labor's loss in 2019 permanently scared Labor from actually having any substantial policy. Like think about it, what the fuck does Keir Starmer actually stand for? Just some like bullshit liberal policy, like this kind of just like, milquetoast like liberalism or whatever. So even if OO can prove that Labor gets elected more, it's unclear as to why you actually get any meaningful change to the extent that Labor's policy program has been hollowed out. They backtracked on things like investing heaps into the NHS. They backtracked on things like nationalising train lines. And so I don't think you would have gotten any of the policy. Secondly, I think Labor's loss in 2019 turns working class voters off because they realised that actually policy programs that are designed to help them are not going to survive in the Labour Party. And so they turn to alternatives like right-wing populists who tell them that their economic grievances are genuine, but they are the only ones that can cater towards them. Or people just don't fucking vote, which means that Labour, into the future, is permanently crippled. Thirdly, at the very worst case scenario, Elena's like, things are just going to keep getting worse and worse, which presumably just means that power keeps flip-flopping between parties. Worst case scenario doesn't seem really bad. Okay, what else does OO say? Firstly, they say circumstances were really bad, so any party would have got voted out. Firstly, a lot of the stuff people were mad about the Tory specific, for example, the cost of living crisis, which is the most salient voting issue right now, is really bad because the Tories didn't give anyone money when inflation was running rampant. Secondly, people evaluate their government in relation to other governments. So even if Labor wasn't perfect, they would have at least looked at Labor relative to other governments who were doing worse than them, and they still would have supported their government. And thirdly, it's outweighed by other matters, which I'm going to go into. And then the other thing I talk about is right-wing backlash, but obviously the incentives for backlash are symmetric because the right wing wants to kind of maximize their electoral chances on either side of the house. Cool. Secondly, this is the crucial extension that I'm going to bring to you. Why would the economy be way, way better under a Corbyn government and actually face the OO challenge that OG never really responds to? Firstly, redistribution is good because obviously now poor people have more money. Not only is that good in and of itself, but it's good for the growth of the market because obviously poor people spend marginally more of their income because there's higher demand. That stimulates growth, which means that companies can afford to hire more people. I think economic growth, every team can probably assume that that's a good thing. Secondly, because of the fact that the Labour Party would have preempted the paralyzing strikes that we've seen for weeks and weeks. Because if they had done things like NHS funding and education funding, or even if they hadn't done it then, but they did it in response to the strikes, you would have stopped the strikes in their place, which means that not only is that better for the economy, because obviously all of the industries being paralyzed is bad for economic growth, but also you would have helped the people that are impacted by that. All of the people that rely on the NHS for healthcare, all of the people who rely on education to be able to send their kids to school and things like that, those people's economic grievances would have been addressed. Yeah.
Given Corbyn did actually get quite a large majority of the youth votes and still lost, in this world, in order for Tory government to lose, where do their votes go? Because I don't think they voted for Corbyn, they would have voted for Corbyn either.
Oh, I don't know, just some weird counterfactual stuff. I mean, we can assume this thing happened, whatever. I'm not going to go too much into it. Mark can respond. Thirdly, increased taxation of the rich. The government obviously just has more funds to allocate. They're better at making decisions than private corporations because they have more knowledge about what is going to be better for economic growth overall, rather than the interests of that specific company, which means that you get more investment that is allocated better. And fourthly, Tories just did fuck up the economy a lot. For example, their universal credit system was awful. They tried to compile all of the different welfare systems, and it just meant a bunch of stuff got cut. They also have done zero infrastructure spending because they have incentives to give handouts to largest corporations that lobby for them. That's not actually a financially efficient allocation of resources. This outweighs opening government because they talk about specific crises, but we tell you at closing government why the economy is better in general, why on a day-to-day basis, the redistributionist policies of a Corbyn Labor government would have stimulated the economy overall. And so not only in these instances of specific crisis, but going long-term into the future, people would have been better off. We actually fill in the missing gaps about why Corbyn would have been able to do the things that he wanted to do. So we take it over OG, we take it over
I think member of God was like. vote please.
Closing government gets ahead in this debate because we give by far the most reasonable idea of what a Jeremy Corbyn prime ministership would look like. We mitigate the risks of the bad things happening and show that there are higher chances of good things happening. But moreover, we show why he is likely to lead a successful economy, which is likely to mitigate almost every single problem that opening opposition raises. And then I guess I'll just do some direct responses to closing opposition. So what is it that he would actually do as a leader? Because we basically hear from the opposition bench a sort of regurgitation of the 2019 Tory fear campaign. We would note that there are 4 reasons to suppose that his, it just wouldn't be Stalin 2.0. First of all, he offered a pretty moderate manifesto in the election, as in it wasn't compared to his previous rhetoric, he offered a pretty moderate manifesto. And we note that parties, when they get elected, never do everything in the manifesto. They always moderate from that manifesto. Second of all, he's well aware of what powers he does have and doesn't have, because he's constrained by the backbenchers, by the civil service, by the limited amount of political capital he has. Third of all, even if he doesn't know that, they will restrain him. And fourth of all, even should he just go completely haywire, he can be replaced because you can have a leadership challenge from within the party. Closing opposition's only response is to point out that when he was a backbencher, he was pretty unruly. And this could just be explained as him making protest votes in order to raise his own status. You can explain that in a rational way that doesn't rely on him being a complete pants-on-head moron. We would also note that once he is in power, the pair of just simply doing things to signal is far less salient than simply the consideration of running something. That is, when he's a backbencher, he doesn't really have any responsibilities, but when he's in government, he is likely to behave differently. And we would note that he is likely, as a result of this moderation, to do 4 policies that are just good. First of all, to do reasonably generous welfare, or rather not to fuck up universal credit, as the Tories did, which has resulted in countless deaths. Second of all, he is likely to have had far better conditions for the health services, to put it in a better condition to handle the oncoming wave of COVID. Third of all, far more infrastructure investment, particularly in the reasonably deprived north. And fourth of all, a far more equitable tax burden that means that the rich people actually pay their share rather than putting the burden on the middle class. We noted that this was good for the economy. 1, because this means there is far higher demand, because when poorer people have more money, they spend that on things, and that means that the economy runs better. But second of all, it simply means that production costs are lower when you have things like happier workers, when you have things like far better infrastructure. And this sort of already responds to opening opposition's claim about how this is likely inflationary, basically because we show how production costs and stuff decrease, which means you simply get more goods on our side. So even if there's a bit more money sloshing around, that's fine. Also, we would note that they probably would have dialed back a little bit on this when inflation started to kick in, such that it wouldn't have been as bad. The second thing that opening opposition says, and this sort of responds to, is where they say that it's impossible to handle crises particularly well, just because there'd be all these nasty things going on. However, we would note that they're not just simply graded on an absolute scale, and people would think, oh, things bad, therefore Labor awful. The thing is they're benchmarked against the likely alternative, right? And so if he's handling COVID slightly better than other countries in Europe, if he's handling it slightly better than Donald Trump in America, that won't be taken to reflect awfully on the Labor government. And similarly in the case of a Brexit deal, because the thing is, it might have been impossible to get a Brexit deal, but the Tories have been tripping over their own feet for a few years trying to get one off the ground. And we think that if it's the case that he put together a half-decent Brexit thing, he can probably just blame the Tories and call it a day. And so we would note that it is likely, in fact, that he is able to get re-elected, or rather that Labor isn't fully electorally doomed, which is the entire premise of the opening opposition case. Basically, because, and we would note that there are other things that mean they're far more electorally viable in the medium to long term. First of all, they don't lose the youth vote when the youth feel utterly betrayed by the way that the Starmerites have purged the party of Corbynites. Second of all, you're far less likely to have lost the entire North and working class and simply become a party of sort of like middle-class people who feel kind of guilty about racism. And third of all, you now have basically the Starmerites in charge, and they're like, oh, we'd love to have a moderate guy in charge. He has less personality than beige carpet, right? Like, there is absolutely no way that this guy is winning an election. He looks like a wet egg. Like, no one is voting for this man. And we would note that this is really important. One, because it is prior to everything else in the debate. And if the economy is doing well, not only does that mean everyone is just having a far better time than otherwise, it means that Labor's electoral chances are pretty good. But second of all, we would note that there is a large asymmetry, which means that we should be risk-seeking in the way we evaluate this debate. Because Britain in its current position is a failed state, right? Like, its infrastructure is crumbling, its social infrastructure is crumbling. People do not trust one another and people are losing faith in the political system. Its economy has not grown in 2 decades. And so we would note that if we are to toss a coin, things go well or things go badly. Look, if they go badly, they get voted out and then things can get returned to normal. But if they go well, that launches them on a trajectory that can then proceed well into the future. Did you take over? Oh, okay.
Sure. Regardless of incentives, Corbyn did not have the capacity to change the public perception of him as the anti-Semitic left-wing extremist face of the party. As we say, Labour actually succeeds in beating the Conservatives regardless of turnout for the next 15 years, and all of the long-term benefits that Aidan says in his speech follow as a result.
It is just I'm not sure how opening opposition has just continually been Labour will be in the next 15 years of elections. Call me back in 2038. The thing is, they're not polling that well. If you look at just how clumsy the Tories are, maybe they get one term of Starmer, who is basically a Tory in all but name. And then after that, maybe once the Conservatives get their act together again, they'll just win the next election, right? Memories aren't that long, right? We thought after Trump, the Republicans would never be able to win another election. 2020 was pretty close. And then the one after that was he might well win that. And so that's why we think it's this claim about them getting infinite Labour forever is, I think, just I don't know, overestimates people's memories. Last of all, quickly on closing opposition, basically what they do is they sort of narrate a few things. Say Jesuit would have done it kind of badly. You get an instant economic crisis. One, I think it's quite clear the market would understand that he would moderate, or at least he would be mindful of this, and his victory speech would say what he's likely to do, what he's not likely to do. Second of all, if the money goes out of England, it goes elsewhere. Other people get money. It's a zero-sum game. The next thing they say is that it'd be really hard to get loans and stuff during COVID. I think this is outweighed by other stuff, such as simply more generous welfare that means people's lives are generally better. For instance, it would still be possible to get loans. You just have to pay a slightly higher interest rate. Also, the markets would likely understand, given his moderation, that he's probably likely to pay the money back, wouldn't demand a super high thing. Similarly, in the case of Brexit, they say, oh, it's super conflicted. He could probably just delegate power to someone else who is trusted by both sides. And okay, look, at the end of this, he's not that much of an idiot. He's reasonably sensible. And if he's not, there's a replacement plan. We think we should take a risk. That's why we're proud to propose.
So, for those on stream, some of the things are very much my opinion, and some of the things are very much not my opinion, and the tone in which I say them will probably indicate that. Cool. Just 2 seconds.
One of those photos is to take us to the LSE Open 2038.
No, I was gonna think we won't be here, but the reach is still here, so it's not impossible. The reach will definitely still be here, yeah. Okay, all ready? Phenomenal. Okay, so let's go back to good old 2019. I want to point out that OG's understanding of history is just incorrect. Boris was the leader. I know that that's a fact claim, but logically, for Boris to have been the leader at the beginning of COVID, he likely had to be the leader a couple of months before COVID, meaning even if they're wrong, they're only wrong by 3 months, not like by the year that they claim they're wrong, and that they claim he wasn't the leader, meaning there was always a clear leader. There was always that Tory cult of personality. There was always that right-wing involvement, which means the first point of opening government is just historically inaccurate. But secondly, on the 2019 shock, CEG wants to respond to our alternative timeline by saying, it wouldn't have been that bad and like his policies weren't that crazy. Corbyn ran on nationalising the trains, Wi-Fi, and essentially taxing corporations and removing the elite from politics. The problem there is whether or not Mark wants to say the markets would not have reacted badly. They had told people that the markets would react badly. Mark then goes, but the money would have gone elsewhere. And yes, as an Irish person, it probably would have gone to Ireland, which is fab, like they would have come over to us. But ultimately what does then hurt me to say is, that means millions and millions of people within the UK have fucking no money, right? And if both government teams want to say that they're worried about how people survive a first of all pandemic, and then through the massive economic shocks that we've all seen through the Ukraine, massive environmental disasters hitting the European continent as a whole, I think it is impossible to say that it would have been as easy for Corbyn to manage those economically when within the first 3 months of his prime ministership, the markets would have reacted terribly. The pound would have plummeted. Note that like even on minor shocks, such as the Brexit vote happening, the pound plummeted to the point where there was no physical pounds left in any bank in Ireland. So we all went in and bought the sterling because it was so low so that we could eventually have more money, obvious. So like I think the problem there is you don't understand that the markets do react. That's a fact claim. Here's some logical claim as to why the markets would have reacted really badly. Markets have been do shake with new leadership and new policy. Why so? Because they take into account the risk of those policies not working out well, but equally a lot of the deals that they've created with the states such as the UK have been based on Tory policy, based on connections with that leadership, that previous leadership, based on 11 years of Tory stability, and based on contracts and tax agreements that they had with that state. If they were afraid Corbyn would follow through on even one of his policies, that was enough to shake the market. Going into COVID with a shaken market means you can't put money into the NHS. And I understand that the Tories are terrible and gave money to their friends, but at least there was some money to have some contracts, to feed some children, to save some nurses, to buy some PPE, to do something within a COVID environment. Let's talk about policy. So CG's reaction to this is, oh look, not every politician enacts every policy. Like just seriously look at his history. It's not a protest vote to back the IRA and the Taliban. Like as a UK, it is if you're Irish, it's not if you're English. Okay, but if you're English, it's not a protest vote. If you're English, it's going against the literal most hated political group within your country and supporting a terrorist group that meant that literally there are no bins in London because they're so afraid of them, right? He's not just a protester. So that gives you lots of reasons as to why he literally went against his own party as leader and not just a backbencher. It's not just isolated protest votes. He continuously went against his party. He continuously went against his backbench. So to say that his backbench could have held him accountable is farcical. But equally note, half of his backbench left the fucking party when he was picked as leader. So we were there to hold him accountable because anybody who had any firm stance over him being an anti-Semitic radicalist meant that they left the party. So I don't know who these rational people left to hold him back are. Finally, even if you're correct in closing government that the politicians would have held him back and ousted him as leader, in the next leadership election, he would have been re-elected by the membership because it was the membership that got him in there in the first place. It was twats that went to Eton who wanted to pat themselves on the back and say that they were woke and they liked Jeremy Corbyn. Okay. How would he have dealt with lots of things coming up? Like Jack is correct. One of the biggest issues with dealing with economic stability when it comes to the idea of Brexit is dealing with the Northern Irish problem, i.e. there is a border between an EU state and a part of the UK. Jeremy Corbyn has zero legitimacy in this situation with any of it. The Irish state don't want to deal with somebody who supports the IRA because we moved away from that 100 years ago. Northern Ireland, half of them really don't want to deal with an IRA supporter, i.e. the Unionists, and even those who used to support the IRA don't want to deal with them because Sinn Féin have moved away from being connected with the IRA so that they have a chance of being a legitimate government. The difference, and this is where like the Zelensky thing is really important. So moving on to the perception of Jeremy Corbyn. I don't like Boris Johnson, but he wanted to live out his Winston Churchill dream and back the bad guy, or back the good guy for once, back the good guy for once, right? He did, and it was easy for him to do so because it wasn't a hard stance to take. The difference is Jeremy Corbyn, to this day, says that we shouldn't give Putin as much shit as we're giving him, that he's not wrong, and that there are Russian people there, because Jeremy Corbyn always backs the radicalists. So.
People were terrified of what would happen in Brazil when Lula was elected president. The markets moved a little bit, but not much, and they recovered.
No. Okay. Radicalists were worried what would happen when that happened. The problem is you want to claim that Jeremy Corbyn is rational, and then you spend time shitting on the guy who is stable, right? You spend time shitting on Keir Starmer, who is stable. The problem here is when CG in particular want to POI about haha Trump is terrible and all these various radical people. The reason we don't want it to be Corbyn is ultimately he was a radical leader, one that would have harmed the UK politics. Why would he have harmed the UK politics? I just don't think it's true that every vote lost by the Tories would have gone to the Labour Party. We think it is likely that it went to people like Nigel Farage and the UK Party. What does that mean? It means 5 years of them holding Corbyn's government accountable to ensure that Brexit goes in line with the British people. It means more microaggressions on the street, not only because they're there, but also because the fucking Prime Minister is anti-Semitic. God love you if you're Jewish in this country at that point, right? I think it leads to a country in which the right get angrier and angrier and angrier. It means that we fill in the gap in opening government where we say it is not just about a Labour government who weren't in during COVID. It's about the Labour government who ultimately are the death of the Labour Party. It is one where they cannot bounce back after not being in government for 11 years and then fucking up so astronomically with Jeremy Corbyn. The comparative is Keir Starmer, who Mark might want to call a wet egg and a Tory in disguise, but ultimately stands for stable economic policy, is respected by those within Europe, Ireland, and the economic people that he has to engage with, and would have a less radical Britain where he was able to keep some level of stability, some functioning state. Yes, he's all fucked up and voted for Brexit, but I think ultimately the best thing you can have is a boring Keir Starmer. The way you get that is by never having voted in Jeremy Corbyn. Very proud to have done.